the ability to communicate online in a confidential way. Now, of course, every technology has two edges, and the same technology that can be used by millions and millions of law-abiding citizens can also be used to conceal criminal activity. And that double edge is, of course, what gets law enforcement and intelligence agencies nervous, and that's what creates some of the human rights tensions that Sheetal talked about. So in that context of sort of reconciling those two sides, encryption policies that you're going to discuss in the breakouts have a difficult task to reconcile and address two important and sometimes competing policy objectives. On the one hand, securing infrastructure, communications, and data. And on the other hand, enabling law enforcement and intelligence agencies to access communications that are targeted and suspected of illegal activities. Now, the encryption policy debate has evolved over the past 4 years, as mentioned before, from a place where the dominant discourse from governments was related to backdoors, a sort of special access for governments into encryption, to, I think, these days a bit more a debate that has shifted to asking companies to set limited or reasonable levels of encryption, and also growing asks from law enforcement to be able to circumvent encryption when they get court orders, what is often referred to as lawful hacking. And in a way, that sort of shifting policy debate also reflects a change in the encryption market. And some encryption services are actually more law enforcement friendly than others. For example, in the last 4 years, we've seen some companies actually getting rid of their ability to decrypt customer content. That is the case on many devices that are encrypted by default. For example, if you have an Apple a smartphone, an iPhone. And also for millions of users using end-to-end encryption for chat messages on WhatsApp or other platforms as well. So that's a changing context for law enforcement. But of course, not all companies have beefed up their encryption levels. And I was reading that, for example, in China, WeChat has encryption in transit, but they don't have encryption on the server side, which actually allows a level of government access and control. So as, again, you get into those breakouts soon, I think that one of the biggest dilemmas facing both law enforcement and companies is how much encryption is enough and who gets to decide. And I think you also have to think about, can encryption policies achieve adequate levels of proportionality between security and human rights? Can things like lawful hacking I just mentioned be a solution that leaves the majority of users protected while targeting only suspected criminals? I mean, I think these are all questions that we need to think about in the current context, and that are very difficult. So it's good to have the expertise of all the people in the room to explore those in the second phase. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for outlining what the issues are, what the fault lines of the debate are, so to speak, but also how complex the challenges are now that things are moving in some spaces, and we won't hear the call for backdoors necessarily go away, but we will see more calls and more use of encryption workarounds. And the question of how much transparency or regulation that needs to follow as a result is a hot question, I know. And you also brought up some other questions around how much encryption is enough. So should there be limitations, and who gets to decide? And I think the really key question, which we'll definitely address in the breakout, which is, can encryption policies respond in an adequate manner to the necessary and proportionate principles? And I'm sure there'll be some debate around that when we look into it. So I'm going to just ask Benga now to to make your intervention, and perhaps to say a few words about how the issue plays out in your context in Nigeria, perhaps, and more broadly, if you'd like to. Thanks, Benga.
Thank you. Benga Shasam with Paradigm Initiative. And just to clarify from the onset that there are two sides to this reaction we see from governments in terms of, encryption and policies. There is the genuine interest in addressing criminal issues, right? And I put genuine in quotes, deliberately. And there is the opportunistic approach, where a government wants to do something, a government wants to clamp down, a government wants to crack down, and then saying that terrorists use encryption then is like an excuse, because the real intention is to actually crack down on either opposition or active voices. And I think it's important to put that out there, because if we don't, then we mix up the entire debate, and then we believe that everyone, actually has intentions to fight crime. That's the reason, why we're having this debate. But that's not true. There are scenarios where, and we can give examples of scenarios where, bills have been drafted, laws have been passed, and a year and a half after the law has been passed, there is not one case, a cybercrime law is passed, and there's not one case of any real cyber criminal activity as defined that has been, taken to court, but there have been 10 cases of journalists or bloggers or media people who have been taken to court or arrested or, even jailed because of an interesting section of that bill. But I think, three key things I want to talk about as we have, this conversation around encryption and human rights is the fact that whatever the policies are, there must be a commitment from, and when I say government, I refer to all levels of government, including security agencies, because one of the reasons why, of course, security agencies react, surprisingly, when you say that there's actually an argument to be made around encryption and human rights, is the fact that this is sort of a disruption to the modus operandi, as far as they're concerned. But I think there's a need to respect process. And by process, I'm not referring to process as stipulated by one side. I'm speaking of process as agreed. One of the things that we found extremely useful is that over the last few months, we've had conversations between unlikely partners. And I say unlikely partners because I'll give an example, say civil society and say a national security agency or things like that. Typically, you would have these two groups think, okay, you know what, this is the enemy or that is the enemy. But you have conversations because people see things based on, where they work. It's like the story of the visually impaired men who were touching the elephant. One was touching the tail and said, this is a rope. The other touched the hair and said, oh my God, this is a big thing. So as far as a lot of security agencies are concerned, everyone is a criminal, literally, So if there's any encryption involved, the question is, and I've had this question asked, in some of our work. We've had cases where we've gone to court and the security agency's response is, what do you have to hide? If you have nothing to hide, why get involved with encryption anyway? And you really want to get offended when you hear that, but when you put yourself in their shoes and realize that everyone is a criminal, right? Like everyone is a potential criminal, so then you can understand where they're coming from there. But when we have more conversations, when we have even robust debate and arguments and analyze scenarios, then you can see where that comes from. And that's why I say that the first thing is we must have a commitment to respect process. There's a reason why, and this is good, by the way, that businesses now subject, in many cases, businesses subject government to their own process, to say that if you make a request for a takedown, we have an internal process. You have to, first of all, get a court warrant before you can request that. Because many years ago, and I know this happens, I hope it doesn't happen in any country anymore, but I know it still does, where you have government officials picking the phone and calling a telecom service provider and saying, listen, there's a threat here, shut it down, without a trace of a letter or a written document that says that we have a court warrant or we have this process in place. So I think that's one, which is important. The other is an interesting trend that we're seeing now, which isn't new, but it's a good thing, to say that human rights is good for business. And, Nicola referred to that when you talked about people who are deliberately getting rid of certain competences because they could be subjected to abuse in terms of, abusing human rights. And so the fact that we have a lot more recognition of the fact that human rights are actually good for business, in the sense that if I use your service and my data is protected, if I use your service and I know that it is not likely that you hand over my data to, to anyone who is about to abuse it in terms of my rights, then I'm likely to respect your services more, and eventually, of course, that's probably good for your business. But apart from this two, in terms of government and businesses, is the fact that citizen awareness is important. There are many times, so we do this training for various institutions, for media, for civil society, even for policymakers, and you will be surprised when we have conversations around privacy. A very simple example was a few years ago, the government of Nigeria, through the central bank, decided that even though people had operated their bank accounts for a very long time, you now had to enroll what was called the bank verification exercise, which was designed to, in a way, check corruption. Maybe not in a way, of course. Government would say designed to check corruption. But no one, well, very few people were asking questions around the fact that why should I give biometric information to get access to banking services I already had access to in a context where there's no data privacy laws? And I think that, apart from the fact that, yes, government needs to be checked, human rights is good for business, citizens also need to be a lot more aware. So any policy that we're designing around encryption should also involve opportunities to make things as simple as possible. We used to think of encryption, and I'm sure you can test this, right, with your various communities. Mention the word encryption with various people, and the first thing that comes to mind is this geeky, it's for geeks and things like that. But right now, everyone literally takes that for granted. End-to-end encryption, I mean, you have people having conversations and saying, which platform should I use that has end-to-end encryption? And we need to demystify encryption, basically. Maybe not by not using the word encryption, but seriously making sure that it is the default, basically the default. And like I said earlier, there's no side of this policy making. There's no way that this policy making should be one-sided. One of the reasons why we've had, I work in civil society. One of the reasons why we've had to maybe go to court to challenge many laws is because many times these bills are drafted with an agenda. And any agenda that is not subjected to a process, I don't want to use the word multi-stakeholder. I think, what word can I replace multi-stakeholder with? Inclusive. I use the word inclusive, yeah. I don't want to say MS. It should be an inclusive process, because if it's an inclusive process, that's where someone can then bring on a different view. Otherwise, you're going to have people, sleep and put their heads in the same direction, and at the end of the day, the policies that come out are going to be bills are basically laws that suspect that everyone is a criminal. Otherwise, why are you trying to hide something through encryption anyway? So yes, the attitude of government needs to change. The attitude of business, good enough is changing, but also the attitude of citizens in terms of the tools that we use. Maybe what we need is, what some have referred to as acquired sophistication, where people make demands that the basic minimum that I want for a service, for a platform, is one that offers encryption. And if you don't bring encryption to the table, then you're literally not considered, regardless of how huge, the size of your market is.
Thank you very much, Benga, and thank you for such a comprehensive treatment of the issues as well. And also what I really liked about what you said was that you set out some of the challenges, but also some solutions, which is also great, because we hear a lot about problems, but not always solutions. And some of those issues that you identified were that there are both legitimate and illegitimate reasons that are used, or justifications that are given for cracking down or for weakening encryption. And that we need to be sensitive to that in our advocacy. And one of the solutions is that we need greater clarity of process. around how these issues are tackled, due process, of course, as well, and that there are actually many good cases to be made for strong encryption that we can use. We're actually, I suppose, quite fortunate in this space that it's one of the issues where civil society groups in general and industry can see eye to eye and the benefits of strong encryption. Of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges, but the legal and technical responses, which aren't human rights respecting, need to be addressed. So, for example, we've mentioned backdoors and maybe some issues around the other responses too. And then you mentioned lastly how there should be a shift around what is considered the norm. And a lot of our advocacy work in this space, as GPD, is exactly doing that and trying to shift the debate, especially in high-level policy spaces, from one which paints encryption, strong encryption, as primarily an enabler of crime, to one which recognizes its integral value as an enabler of human rights and trust and security in the network. And so where basically it would just be inconceivable for people to demand anything but strong encryption. So hopefully we're moving in that direction, and what is really important is, of course, legal and policy responses that ensure that reality. And we'll come to what those might or might not look like in the breakout session. We technically have just half an hour left, but we started a bit late, and I'm aware that in the following session there are we're getting into the detail of laws and policies, so there might be some questions from the floor for our panelists. So I'd like to take just under 5 minutes to take any questions, should you have them. If you could introduce yourself, and if you also have a question for one of the panelists in particular, if you could direct it at them, that would be great. So I'm opening up now to the floor for any questions. Yes, the gentleman there.
Hello, my name is Daniel. I'm from Youth IGF Brazil, and what I really think is that this discussion, we should be talking more about the future. The panorama will change soon. We have quantum computing coming here. Microsoft released C# language with a simulator. Google has a simulated alien quantum computer. The encryption standards will change drastically, and the governments, the companies will get over it. What we should be discussing is to don't let them do this kind of thing. Approving laws. In Brazil, we had WhatsApp blocked 2 times because they couldn't investigate it. And bills will be passed. What we really should do for the future?
Thank you for that question, which I'll definitely put to the panelists in a second, but I wanted to make sure that we got a couple questions at least. Are there any other questions at this point? No? Okay, so there's just that one pretty challenging question, I think, about the future. Oh, excellent, excellent. There's also a question from a remote participant.
Yeah, so in terms of, so Cyrus Vance Jr., who's the New York District Attorney, calling for weaker encryption from companies, he's saying how do we explain that it is a backdoor? Because he's saying it's not a backdoor. How do we explain that it is?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. So we'll take both of those questions together. I think the first one on the future of encryption, the challenges that certain developments like quantum computing might bring to this debate. And then secondly, perhaps more back to the present day, what are some of the arguments that can be put forth to those who argue for regulated encryption and actually making clear that those requests are a form of asking for weakened encryption. So Nicola, would you like to take that one?
I'll try. Yeah, I mean, on the future, and that gets back to the discussion we had before about encryption by default. I think that's really something that a lot of efforts in the technical community are being put into making sure that you don't have to think about enabling encryption, right? And also I think that's something that we see with, again, WhatsApp and iMessages turning on encryption by default. And I think that's very important as well because, and I think in the future you'll see again more and more encryption by default across services from a technical perspective and not a legal one. And I think that's important because I had a discussion with someone the other day that said that, well, the challenge is when you make encryption a choice for users, well, there are certain countries where people will be bullied into turning off encryption or not using encryption or criminalize encryption. So again, I think that the more you make encryption a sort of default thing in the background that people don't have to think about, the better. On the second question, well, there have been reports from several eminent technical experts in the past that have really, I think, confirmed the fact that you cannot have, again, good encryption, an access, sort of backdoors for good guys that bad guys cannot access. And when you talk about weaker encryption versus backdoors, at the end of the day, I mean, that's still a vulnerability that either criminals or foreign countries or, will use in one way or the other. So I think that's really a fine line. And, of course, I raised the question in my intervention on, can we find, is there a level of sufficient encryption that sort of, again, enables governments to have some ways to circumvent and leave sort of general level of protection for all people, but I think that's, again, a really tricky question because, in a way, from a technical perspective, you have strong encryption or you don't. So I think that's one of the challenges that sort of slips over in the policy discussions as well.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I know, Benga, you need to run off relatively soon. Would you like to continue?
Yeah, so when it comes to the weak encryption conversation, I mean, I find it interesting because there are two key things, right, when we talk about encryption. And there's intent, right, and there's opportunity. So if you weaken encryption, does that remove the intent? It doesn't. If you weaken encryption, it actually increases the opportunity. So what you do with weaker encryptions is that you do nothing to the intent, which you think you're trying to correct, but you actually increase the opportunity. It's like, you lock all the doors in the house, they're all strong, and you leave just one open. I mean, if you live in a city where every weekend you read reports about robberies, you probably don't want to argue that, or you want to fly a plane with a weaker engine. I'm not sure you want to do that. And in terms of the future, one of the things that I'm sure that, every engineer who worked on, packet switch and everything around the internet, one of the things that I'm sure they also talked about is that if we had an opportunity to start all over again, everything will be designed with encryption as default. So going forward, Internet of Things and anything that has not even been named, we now have an opportunity to set the lowest bar. And I think that in all of our interests, the lowest bar should be that everything should be encrypted.
Thank you very much, Benga. So I feel like a few points are coming through very strongly around what human rights respecting encryption policy might look like. And one of those is that strong encryption by default should be the norm, and it should be where there is any reference to encryption in policy and law, it should be to protect strong encryption. There are nuances, obviously, to this, and there are ways that laws and policies are written which may complicate this. There are different types of laws and policies, from cybercrime acts to strategies to all sorts of different types of instruments that deal with this issue. And what we want to do in the next session, and I'm going to invite my colleague Richard to help facilitate it, is to match real-life laws and policies, so to take this perhaps at some point abstract conversation to the real world, and consider whether those might be human rights respecting or not. So what I'm actually going to ask you to do, and it's a pretty radical thing to do at the IGF, is to stand up. Is it? Please stand up. And then Richard, would you like to come over and help us to get into this next session? We need to explain the rules. So, yeah. Okay. So, if you find the people next to you and group together, I know that the chairs are mobile, so you can move them around. If we have 7 groups, that would work really well. So perhaps just naturally find the people around you to group together with. And I would ask Nikolai to join one of the groups too, in case you're interested. And then we will distribute a table and a set of excerpts from policy and law. And we would ask you to consider which of the excerpts relates to the criteria which are set out in the table, to have a discussion about that, be able to justify it when we come back in plenary in 10 minutes, and to match that on the table. So it should become a lot clearer when you see the table and the excerpts, and we'll go right ahead. Richard, do you want to add anything? Okay, great. We'll come back in plenary in 4 minutes. Right, so we are going to get started. I know that there was some disagreement. There was also some confusion about how to use the table, but I think through discussion we should hopefully come to some interesting conclusions. Can I ask, first of all, I'm just going to ask for volunteers, but then we can go around the table, the tables. Can I ask for a volunteer to say whether they found any policies which were clearly human rights respecting on this table? Anyone want to volunteer? Were there? Yes.
So we weren't completely sure, I guess, but we found that policy number 8 was quite respecting.
Yeah, did anyone disagree with that? No. Okay, great, fantastic. Were there any where it was clearly not human rights respecting?
We thought number 3.
Number 3.
Oh, sorry, we were not sure about that. No, we had quite a few in the last study.
Not sure. So number 3, which is one relating to decryption. Why were you not sure about that one?
Particularly because of the...
Could you use a mic? I mean, not that speak loud.
We're civil servants, we can't speak.
Okay. Did anyone else have any opinions on number 3?
It's this one. Oh, no, sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine. Another one though. Yes, over there.
Yeah, we definitely found number 3 not human rights respecting. Actually, almost all of them except 8 and 9 were in that category for us.
Oh, okay. And why would you say that number 3 is not human rights respecting? There's a language there regarding safeguards, for example.
The language, the safeguards are nowhere near strong enough that, you know, that the officer reasonably believes and whatever. I would not go all that much detail without time, but we found these safeguards to be nowhere near sufficient to be really human rights respecting.
Okay, thank you. I know we have some experts in the room who work on this issue a lot. I was wondering if any of you have any opinions as to where decryption orders might be human rights respecting, or where the language can be strong enough. Is there any? Yes, Rihanna.
I'm not generally in favor of any kind of compelled decryption law in general, but I would say that number 6 comes fairly close in terms of how it is a technical assistance requirement, but that only requires decryption where the provider itself has provided it or imposed the encryption, and wouldn't require it in situations where the user has had an extra level of encryption and there's a level of judicial review that's included. So, you know, this is not my favorite thing, but it at least comes a little closer than some of the other examples that we've seen.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So there's some criteria there in what you mentioned about what strong enough safeguards might look like when it comes to decryption orders. Did you have a comment there, sorry, on that table?
Well, on number 3, there is missing that there is a safeguard against self-incrimination order. Because, well, you can order, maybe you can order a witness to decrypt information, but not somebody who is accused of something. And this does not distinguish between both of them.
Okay, so there's an issue with the lack of clarity in the text there, in the language there. Thank you, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe just to add to that, because we had a discussion also on the witness and the suspect side of the decryption order. But what I do like about 3 is that it's quite specific on the search warrant, the specified premises, the authorized named officers, and the court order for that. So at least these criteria, I think, are good in number 3.
Okay, great. We made the effort to de-identify these, of course, because of the space that we're in. But like I said, these are taken from real laws and policies, and obviously there's a disagreement here about whether there adequate safeguards exist in some of these decryption orders, for example. Were you convinced by that on that table about 3?
No.
Okay, so stronger safeguards needed. What about number 6? That's pretty strong from what we've heard.
We may have some prejudice against ministries for the interior, but...
Okay, that is interesting. Okay, so we have a couple minutes left. Were there any others where people felt they wanted to share their views on how the language could be said to be either human rights respecting or not, or wanted any clarification on any of those? Nope. Okay. Yes? That side?
I'm just wondering, because I'm reading a lot of the laws they have and some of the discussion we had before this. It feels like there's a lot of issue of self-incrimination involved there, because if you're charged for an offense in court, they can't exactly question you and force you to confess to a crime. Neither should the police officer be able to do that. And in that case, wouldn't decrypting or presenting a way to decrypt your data itself tantamount to a confession in some cases? I mean, it might not necessarily be the offense you're charged for, but I think in India there's a lot of cases where you're ordered to decrypt something to show a message you have, and next thing you know, you're prosecuted for something else.
Yeah, yes, I think the question around self-incrimination is one of the more interesting aspects of the debate, and certainly relates to decryption very clearly, and I understand the law depends on the jurisdiction and when it comes to self-incrimination. And whether you have a right to not self-incriminate. But Richard, did you have any comments on that particularly?
Yes, well, I mean, you're right that there is a general sort of the right to sort of due process rights in international law, but the right to, or the right not to self-incriminate does vary quite a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Maybe one question which looks at, so a number of people said that they felt that question 2 wasn't human rights respecting. And I wondered why, as this was just a law which required witnesses to assist courts in providing evidence or documents upon a court request, why you think this wouldn't be a human rights respecting piece of legislation. The police bit at the end.
So it's the police bit at the end that concerned you, not the fact that there could be compulsion or in some ways to comply with court orders. Okay, good. That's good to know.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up here, but I hope you found that instructive and thought-provoking. There are a few things that I feel did come out of the discussion here, and certainly have come out a lot of the discussions on this issue in the past few years. One is that from a human rights perspective, strong encryption by default should be the norm because of its important role as an enabler of human rights and trust and security in the network. That any restrictions should be very limited, targeted, the law should be clear, it doesn't suffice that it exists, that there should be due process and very strong safeguards against abuse, and we heard from Rihanna there what those might look like. And then we lastly touched upon this a bit, about where the debate is moving. The use of encryption workarounds is part of that, of course. There are various different types of encryption workarounds. We've talked a bit about decryption, which is one of any number of encryption workarounds. So when law enforcement, for example, can't access information which is encrypted, they will either find other ways, and one of those is obviously decryption. Not necessarily agreement around what that might look like for it to be human rights respecting, perhaps, but some idea of what that would look like, very strong safeguards, for example. But also, what I think is a really interesting aspect of this debate and where it's moving is legal hacking and the use of exploits and vulnerabilities that do exist in software because humans make it. As opposed to actually introducing backdoors or introducing vulnerabilities, using those that are already there, which is happening, and whether or not that might be a solution going forward. And if it is, which is a very contentious topic, what that would look like, how much transparency and regulation is needed. And I know that that's going to be the topic of a debate on Thursday, I think it is. So I hopefully see many of you there. Lastly, before you go, we have, as part of our work on this issue, developed some tools to support human rights advocacy on this issue. I have a few copies of our guide to encryption policy for human rights defenders, which explains the link to, I'll find those in a second, the link to human rights. Well, first it explains what encryption is. It explains its relationship to human rights, the spaces at the national, regional, and global level, that encryption policy, where it's being made, and some key policy messages or key messages that advocates can use in their advocacy. So if that's of interest, please come and talk to me or Richard. And it's also online. So you can find the guide to encryption policy for human rights defenders by Googling that, by using a search engine of your choice. Sorry. Whoops. Okay. By using a search engine of your choice, or going to the GPD website. So thank you very much for staying. And for contributing to this discussion. I hope you found it useful, and I'll see you, many of you, around soon.
Stop there, that's fine, and you can stop there. Just a shortcut to the reality.